Al Capone, also known as Scarface, was one of America's most influential and violent gangsters of the early 20th century. Despite his criminal reputation, Capone was able to evade arrest via the relationships he cultivated with important political figures in Chicago. For a time, he was seen as a modern-day Robin Hood due to his charitable donations, but the cracks began to show in the late 1920s when his true nature came to light, one that was seen as cruel and deadly, and his ultimate descent began. But who exactly was Al Capone, and what made him turn to a life of crime? In this documentary, we aim to shed light on the answers to these questions, and more, as we take a look at the rise and fall of Al Capone. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York City. He was the fourth of 8 children born to Gabriele and Teresa Capone, both of whom were Italian immigrants originally from Angri, a small commune outside of Naples, who traveled to New York 5 years earlier. The couple settled at 95 Navy Street, and both held down jobs, Gabriele as a barber and Teresa as a seamstress, although they later relocated to Garfield Place when Capone was 11. Like most immigrants, the Capones were hard-working, law-abiding, and showed a strong desire to fit in. Gabriel took to the English language and American slang quickly and easily, but the couple often stood out because their religion, Roman Catholicism, was not mainstream at the time. After years of struggle and turmoil, immigrants from other areas of Europe were finally starting to be accepted and build their own communities. But as the Capones were from Italy, they didn't quite fit in with other settlers either. By age 10, Al Capone had begun to behave in a tough and brash manner, something he would carry into his adult life. 4 years later, he formed the Navy Street Gang, which put an end to the harassment of Italian women and girls by their Irish neighbors. Around this same time, he dropped out of school. Capone had been a good pupil for most of his school career and was intelligent, but he struggled with authority and was often running into trouble. What spurred on his leaving from school appears to have been a particularly bad dispute with a teacher, which ended in Capone hitting the woman in the face. Following this nasty incident, the teenager was expelled, and he decided it was time for him to leave education altogether and enter the workforce with his parents and older siblings. For a time, it looked like his future was uncertain. Following his departure from education, Capone learned how to handle a knife and fire a gun, and eventually joined a gang whose lineage traced back to the 5 Points Gang in Manhattan. He briefly spent time working at a sweet shop and a bowling alley, and from 1916 to 1918, he played semi-professional baseball. At some point, shortly before his stint in the world of sports, he met Johnny Torrio, an Italian-born mobster who helped build the Chicago outfit, an organized crime syndicate that Capone would later go on to control. He regarded Torrio as a mentor. Torrio had set up an office on 4th Avenue and Union Street at the center of Capone's mostly Italian neighborhood, out of which he ran the 5 Points Gang. However, he moved to Chicago in 1909, leaving the youngster in the business in the hands of Frankie Yale. By the age of 16, Capone was described as a brutish brawler who could knock out an opponent in a single punch. He was hired by Yale to work as a collector, gathering payments from both customers who frequented the Harvard Inn in Coney Island, which was part bar, part brothel, and from the women who worked there trading sex for cash. He was then moved to a position as a bouncer and a bartender. During one particularly heated exchange, Capone insulted a patron's sister, and in return was slashed with a bottle opener. He was left with 3 gouges in his skin, earning him the infamous nickname Scarface. Unsurprisingly, Capone was furious at this turn of events and wanted to retaliate in violence. But as the patron was a member of another crime family, Yale convinced him to let it pass, informing Capone that he had violated an unwritten rule by disrespecting family members. Biographers have noted that his quick recognition of rules and family values both of which led him to use the patron later as a bodyguard, showed that he had respect for those things, and, in turn, a line that he supposedly did not cross. At the age of 19, Capone met and married May Josephine Coughlin, a 21-year-old Irish Catholic woman who gave birth to their son, Albert Francis "Sonny" Capone, in November of 1918. On December 30th, the couple tied the knot, although they'd had to seek the permission of Capone's parents as he was not yet 21. Their child, Sonny, lost most of his hearing in his left ear during childhood. Bizarrely, despite Capone's criminal career and reputation for violence, his marriage to May was said to be a very happy one. After the couple married, Capone sought to return to a respectable life and quit working for Yale. Wishing to avoid the temptations of his old life, he moved to Baltimore and took a job as a bookkeeper. But he was drawn back to Brooklyn and the criminal underworld in 1920 when his father died of a heart attack on November 14th. For Capone, the pressure was now on. Not only did he need to support his wife and child, but the remainder of his family now relied on him to help out financially following Gabrielle's demise. Returning to his life of crime, Capone was recruited by his mentor, Johnny Torrio, and moved to Chicago, his family following not far behind. His decision to move to Illinois was less of a conclusion he reached on his own, and more something that he had to do. Back in New York, he had been causing a ruckus, drawing the attention of the police after he had killed several individuals while working under Yale. It was decided that Torrio was the perfect person to guide Capone, who was seen as capable but rash, and that often brought unwanted problems. In Chicago, Capone was quickly promoted to head bouncer and bartender at the Four Deuces, a 4-story building containing Torrio's business offices, a brothel, and several gambling dens. He was soon made a quarter partner, being awarded a share of the company's annual profits, and he learned how to make money from seedy activities such as bootlegging and gambling. To cover for his business dealings, he opened a second-hand furniture store and carried business cards which declared his job as a furniture dealer. With Prohibition in full swing, Capone and Torrio arranged to have bootleggers in Canada help smuggle liquor into the U.S., and the pair worked together to expand their businesses, with Capone acting as Torrio's right-hand man, although the two had very different styles. Capone was still rash and violent, while Torrio was diplomatic and clever. He wanted to avoid attracting attention to his organization and was always one step ahead of other gangs, such as when Prohibition came to an end. He also organized political and police protection for his business and his men. Then, on May 8, 1924, Joe Howard, who is described as a small-time thug, attacked Capone's partner in the prostitution business for turning him down for a loan. Capone sought out Howard and demanded that he explain himself, but he refused and hurled slurs at the mobster. Capone retaliated by shooting him dead on the spot in front of numerous witnesses, who, of course, could not recall seeing the murder, and so the crime remained unsolved. It has been suggested that Capone lashed out because he had lost his brother, Frank, 2 months earlier. Frank and their other brother, Ralph, had been recruited into the organization by Capone years earlier. Despite the lack of witness testimony, the press ran the story of Howard's demise and pointed the finger blatantly at Capone, who was reportedly described at the time as a boxing promoter. At the end of that same year, Torrio ordered a hit on Dean O'Banion, the leader of a rival syndicate named the Northside Gang, an Irish-Polish-American organization. On November 10, 1924, O'Banion was gunned down at his flower shop. Following his demise, his replacement, Earl Weiss, swore to carry out revenge on the killers and made it his top priority. In January 1925, Weiss and another of his men ambushed Torrio, shooting him several times. Following his recovery, he was fined $5,000 and sentenced to 9 months behind bars for operating a brewery, and by the time he was released, he decided that enough was enough. He handed Capone, now 26, the organization and left Chicago. It didn't take long before Capone began using violent means to increase profit. Businesses that declined to buy his alcohol were subject to vicious attacks, including bombings, and as many as 100 people were killed in such events. As the boss of the Chicago outfit, Capone was not afraid to flex his wealth. A jazz fan, he once asked clarinet player Johnny Dodds to play a song that he was unfamiliar with. He split a $100 bill in half and told Dodds he would get the other half when he earned it. Capone was also known to indulge in lavish expenses: custom suits, cigars, gourmet meals, flamboyant jewelry, and of course, female companionship. In response to questions about what he did to earn such wealth, Capone would often respond with statements like, "All I do is satisfy public demand," and "I am just a businessman, giving the people what they want." He gained a reputation up and down the country, although at the time, it was not necessarily a bad one. After taking over town council elections, using less than savory methods, Capone based himself in Cicero, Illinois, making it harder for his enemies from the North Side gang to reach him, although his driver was found tortured and murdered at one point. The rivalry continued throughout 1926. In September, the North Side gang opened fire with submachine guns at Capone's headquarters at the Hawthorne Inn, while other gunmen used shotguns on the ground floor windows. While the mobster called for a truce, it wasn't long before negotiations stalled and eventually failed. The following month, the North Siders' leader, Earl Weiss, was murdered. In January 1927, Capone's friend and the owner of the Hawthorne Inn restaurant was kidnapped and killed in retaliation. For Capone, this feud seemed to fuel his instinct for self-preservation, and he dreamed of getting away from Chicago. In 1928, he purchased a property at 93 Palm Avenue on Palm Island, Florida, for $40,000, which he used as a winter home, and eventually resided there until his death. Beginning in the spring of 1927, a series of attempted assassinations against Capone began. 2 years earlier, a new head was appointed to the Unione Siciliana, a Sicilian-American benevolent society, which had now been infiltrated and influenced by organized crime. One man, Joe Aiello, was angry that he had not been given the leadership position and blamed Capone for the arrangement. As a result, he severed his business ties with men who aligned themselves with the mobster and instead joined up with Capone's enemies. On one occasion, to rid himself of Capone, he offered money to the chef of the mobster's favorite restaurant, Bella Napoli Cafe, asking him to put acid in Capone's soup. But the chef, instead, relayed the request to Capone himself. Naturally, the violence only escalated from there. In response to this attempted assassination, Capone sent his men to destroy one of Aiello's stores, located on West Division Street, with gunfire. Over 200 bullets were fired at the bakery on May 28, 1927, and Aiello's brother, Antonio, was injured during the bombardment. Throughout the year, several of the hitmen hired to take out Capone were found dead. At least 10 of the men who attempted to collect on a $50,000 reward Aiello was offering for Capone's demise wound up deceased. Even one of the mobster's allies attempted to take him out but failed when another member of the outfit learned of his plan. In November, Aiello tried to organize ambushes in various locations to get to Capone, but an anonymous tipster reported the plots to the police, and they were subsequently foiled. 5 gunmen were arrested following the reveal of the attacks, one of whom admitted that Aiello had hired them to carry out a hit on Capone, and so law enforcement took Aiello into custody. When he heard of the arrest, Capone sent almost 24 armed men to stand outside the station and await the release of his rival. The media waited by the scene to capture footage of Aiello's expected murder. However, it did not take place at this time. In May of 1929, one of Capone's bodyguards discovered that 3 of his own men were plotting against him. They had been persuaded by Aiello to take him out and take over the Chicago outfit. Capone's violent nature subsequently emerged when he decided to personally take a baseball bat to each of the individuals involved in the plan. Once they'd been severely bloodied, he had his bodyguards shoot them. In 1930, Capone, fed up of the feud, discovered where Aiello had been hiding out, in an apartment building in Chicago where he was attempting to avoid retaliation. On October 23rd, Capone's men finally executed his enemy by shooting from the windows of the apartment block across the street as Aiello left the safety of his hideout to get a taxi. Being a hardened gangster in the 1920s didn't come without its hindrances, however. Politicians and law enforcement sought to put an end to corruption, violence, and general criminal degeneracy, and they had to be dealt with. Capone is believed to have helped William Hale Thompson in many of his political victories, including his mayoral election campaign in 1927. Thompson was a Republican candidate known as Big Bill, who served as Chicago's mayor twice, the first time between 1915 and 1923, and the second between 1927 and 1931. And critics have named him an unethical mayor due to his relationship with Al Capone. During his second election campaign, Thompson promised to clean up the streets of Chicago, banishing criminals and misconduct. However, when he hinted at reopening illegal saloons, Capone became interested and allegedly donated $250,000 to Thompson's campaign, which accepted the money without question. Capone's journey to control the city's government wasn't plain sailing, though. Everywhere he went, the mobster seemed to make enemies, and in politics, it was no different. Italian-born Joseph Esposito, a Republican alderman, took a disliking to Capone and became his political rival. This didn't end well for Esposito, who met his demise on March 21, 1928, following a drive-by shooting in front of his house. Meanwhile, in order to secure Thompson's success, Capone's men targeted voting booths in wards where Thompson's opposition was believed to have support. In the lead-up to what is now known as the Pineapple Primary, on Election Day, April 10, 1928, 62 bombings occurred in the city of Chicago, with at least 2 politicians being killed in the process. The chief bomber of the Chicago outfit, James Belcastro, was believed to have killed 15 people with his attacks and was accused of the murder of Octavius Grenady, an African-American lawyer who threatened Thompson's candidacy for the African-American vote. Octavius was chased through the streets on polling day by cars of gunmen before he was shot dead, and 4 policemen were also charged with the murder. However, all charges were dropped when key witnesses recanted their statements. Interestingly, when Belcastro was shot and wounded in 1931, the police reportedly told the media that Belcastro worked alone, indicating the attitude they held towards Capone and his organization. One of the most notable incidents of Capone's career was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. While he was in his Florida home at the time of the event, he is widely believed to have orchestrated what was an attempt to take out George Bugs Moran, the new head of the Northside Gang. The alleged motivation for this attack was that the Chicago outfit's expensive whiskey, imported from Canada, had been hijacked while on its way to Cook County, Illinois. In the weeks leading up to the massacre, Capone put Moran under surveillance, stationing his men in a flat across from Moran's headquarters, which were based at 2122 North Clark Street. On February 14, 1929, 4 gunmen disguised as police officers went to the door of the headquarters and carried out a police raid, where they lined up 7 gang members along a wall and killed them. None of the men were Moran. Photographs of the bloodbath hurt Capone's public image, as citizens were shocked that such cruelty was occurring without intervention from the law. Furthermore, Moran reportedly missed the shootings by just a few minutes and allegedly told reporters, "Only Capone kills like that." Just days after the photographs were made public, Capone was to testify before a Chicago grand jury on charges of federal prohibition violations, but claimed to be too unwell to attend. In the meantime, he donated to various charities and set up a soup kitchen during the Depression. Further throwing a wrench into the works is the fact that much of the public became displeased and disturbed by Mayor Thompson's alliance with Capone. Reportedly, this was a factor in Thompson losing the 1931 election. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre appeared to be an eye-opener for many in the city, including the publisher of the Chicago Daily News, Walter Strong. Strong spoke with President Herbert Hoover, who was a personal friend, and requested that a federal intervention occur. On March 19, 1929, Strong, accompanied by Frank Loesch of the Chicago Crime Commission and attorney Laird Bell, made their case to Hoover. Following this, a plan of attack was created with the assistance of multiple agencies that wished to apprehend Capone. The Treasury and Justice Departments created plans for income tax prosecutions against numerous Chicago gangsters, while an elite squad of Prohibition Bureau agents were dispatched to tackle the problem of bootleggers. A writer for the Chicago Daily News dubbed these men untouchables, in reference to their inability to be corrupted. Strong, for his part, used his newspaper's resources to gather information on Capone's gang and their plans, and shared it with the groups gearing up to take him down. Capone was finally arrested by the FBI on March 27, 1929, upon leaving a Chicago courtroom. After faking sickness previously in order to avoid testifying, in the end, he'd had to testify to a grand jury that was investigating violations of federal prohibition laws. Additionally, he's charged with contempt of court for feigning illness when the FBI obtained statements that noted Capone, whose doctor had claimed he was bedbound with illness and was unable to travel to Chicago for the testimony, had actually been gambling at the racetracks in Miami, had flown to Bimini, and had attended a cruise to Nassau, all the while in seemingly good health and spirits. Furthermore, less than 2 months later on May 16th, Capone, along with his bodyguard, was arrested in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, for carrying a concealed deadly weapon. The following day, he was indicted by a grand jury, and a trial was held before Philadelphia Municipal Court Judge John Walsh. He entered a guilty plea and was sentenced to 1 year in prison. On August 8th, he was transferred to the city's Eastern State Penitentiary, and he was released early for good behavior in March of 1930 after serving 9 months. Just 1 month later, though, Capone was arrested on vagrancy charges when visiting Miami Beach. Reportedly, the governor had ordered law enforcement to drive him out of Florida. The mobster claimed that he had been refused food and water and that the police had threatened to arrest his family, and he was charged with perjury for making these statements, although he was acquitted shortly afterwards in July after going through a 3-day trial. The legal troubles for Capone didn't end there, however, as in September, a Chicago judge issued a warrant for Capone's arrest on charges of vagrancy. Shortly afterwards, the judge used the publicity garnered from this decision to run against Mayor Thompson in the Republican primary. In February of 1931, Capone was then tried on his contempt of court charge from 1929, after he had faked sickness to dodge testifying. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison, but the mobster remained free while he appealed the conviction. Between 1929 and 1931, Capone and his organization were linked to numerous murders. The New York Times suggested he was involved in the 1926 slaying of Assistant State Attorney William McSwiggan, as well as the 1929 executions of Chief Investigator Ben Newmark and his former friend and mentor Frankie Yale, while in 1930, the Chicago outfit was connected to the killing of Julius Rosenheim, who served as a police informant in the organization for 2 decades. Much later, after his conviction, Capone would be accused of the murder of Edward J. O'Hare, who had worked with investigators to help bring him down and had, until that point, been a collaborator of the outfit. Still, try as they might, authorities were unable to pin down enough evidence that would put Capone away for a lengthy sentence, allowing them time to dismantle the Chicago outfit. Witnesses refused to testify, and physical evidence was difficult to come by. There became a point where investigators knew that they'd have to change tactics in order to finally nail down Capone. Assistant Attorney General Mabel Walker Willebrandt came up with the idea of charging affluent individuals involved with organized crime with federal tax evasion. A few years earlier, in 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in United States v. Sullivan that this notion was legally sound, as illegitimate earnings were still subject to income tax. Capone's brother Ralph, who worked for the Chicago outfit, was tried for tax evasion in 1930. He went on to spend 18 months in prison after he was convicted. Capone became afraid that he might face the same fate and had his lawyer regularize his tax position, which led to his lawyer stating Capone's income for 1928 and 1929 had been $100,000. This meant that the government received a letter with this information and an admittance that no tax had been paid on his sizable income. As a result, on March 13, 1931, Capone was charged with income tax evasion. On June 5, 1931, he was indicted by a federal grand jury on 22 counts of income tax evasion spanning from 1925 to 1929. He was further indicted on 5,000 violations of the National Prohibition Act. At the Chicago Federal Building on June 16 that same year, Capone pled guilty to all charges as part of a 2.5-year prison sentence plea bargain. However, the following month, on July 30th, Judge James Herbert Wilkerson, a prominent judicial figure with a dislike of Capone, refused to honor the plea bargain, and as a result, Capone and his lawyers rescinded the guilty plea. Wilkerson was intent on convicting Capone and admitted into evidence the lawyer's letter to federal authorities regarding the mobster's tax status, overruling objections from the defense, which said a lawyer could not confess on behalf of his client. It was also determined that Capone would only be tried on the income tax evasion charges as they were deemed to be more important than the prohibition violations. Capone's lawyers had just hours to prepare for the trial as a result of the plea bargain falling through, and they claimed that the mobster lost most of his income to gambling. However, this argument was weakened by the fact that, if this had been true, Capone was spending well beyond his means, and his spending habits were talked through in great detail as the prosecution asked how he could afford numerous properties, vehicles, and extravaganzas such as diamond belt buckles when he supposedly had such little income. He was ultimately convicted on 5 counts of income tax evasion on October 17, 1931, and was sentenced to 11 years in prison. Additionally, he was fined $50,000, along with $7,692 for court costs, and was held liable for $215,000 plus interest due to his back taxes. He was also ordered to serve his contempt of court sentence, which was 6 months long, simultaneously. Capone had reportedly boasted shortly before his conviction, "They can't collect legal taxes from illegal money." Capone was 33 years old when he was finally imprisoned. He was sentenced to Atlanta U.S. Penitentiary in May of 1932. It was here that he was diagnosed with syphilis and gonorrhea, diseases he is believed to have contracted while working at a brothel following his move to Chicago. It was also discovered that he was suffering withdrawal symptoms as he had become addicted to cocaine, his use of which was so great that it had punctured his septum. After settling into life in prison, Capone began working, stitching soles on shoes for 8 hours a day. He was seen as a competent worker while he was behind bars, but reportedly, his letters home were barely coherent. Many of his fellow inmates saw him as a weak personality who struggled to cope with the harassment and violence that went on inside the prison. One small-time criminal who had previously been associated with the Chicago outfit, Red Rudensky, became concerned that he would have a breakdown and began protecting him, which only served to fuel suspicions that the mobster was receiving special treatment, although no evidence was ever found to support this allegation. Still, the rumors, along with accusations that he had been caught bribing prison guards, prompted officials to move Capone to Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary off the coast of San Francisco in August of 1934. Alcatraz had only recently opened on August 11th and was supposed to be a last resort facility for those who continuously caused trouble. During transportation, prisoners were handcuffed and guarded by dozens of FBI agents and U.S. Marshals. Upon his arrival at Alcatraz, Warden James Johnston asked Capone his name, to which the mobster replied, "You know who I am." Johnston reportedly told him, "Here you are now known as AZ-85. This line is noted to be almost like an act of defiance on the part of the prison guards of the new facility. Capone was no longer getting his way, no longer had any power, and was truly struggling with his new surroundings. On June 23, 1936, Capone was stabbed and wounded by another inmate, James Texas bank robber Lucas, who was serving 30 years for bank robbery and the first-degree murder of a federal employee. According to reports, Lucas stabbed Capone in the back with a pair of scissors from the prison's barbershop. Capone had been working in the laundry area nearby and threw Lucas against the wall in response. The alleged motivation for this attack was that many of the inmates were angry with the mobster for not taking part in an inmate strike. Lucas was sent to solitary confinement as punishment for the incident, and Capone's wound was found to be superficial. Capone was a model prisoner. As a reward for his good behavior, he was permitted to play banjo in the prison band, named the Rock Islanders. The band held concerts every Sunday for the other inmates. He also wrote the song Madonna Mia as a tribute to his wife, May. In 2009, a copy of the sheet music and lyrics for the tune was put up for sale for $65,000. And later that year, it was recorded and released on CD by a group of musicians and a vocalist led by Rich Larson, who ran the website ChicagoMobMuseum.com. Marking Capone's time in prison was the fact that he was becoming more and more ill as the years went by. Neurosyphilis, which he was diagnosed with in February of 1938, steadily eroded his mental capabilities. Capone had been aware that he had contracted syphilis long before he was diagnosed with it in prison, but had failed to seek treatment for it, leading to a massive decline in his health at this time. He spent his last year at Alcatraz in the hospital wing, frequently seeming confused and lost. He completed his term in the facility on January 6, 1939, and was moved to the Federal Correctional Institution at Terminal Island in California, a low-security prison where he would serve his sentence for contempt of court. However, he was paroled on November 16 that year after his wife, May, appealed to the court, citing his mental difficulties. By this time, he had served 7 years, 6 months, and 15 days of his sentence, and had repaid all his fines and back taxes. Following his release, he was referred to the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland, so he could receive treatment for his illness. However, the hospital refused to treat him due to his infamous reputation, which portrayed him as a tremendously violent man. The nearby Union Memorial Hospital accepted him instead. Grateful for the compassion he was shown, Capone donated 2 Japanese cherry trees to the hospital that year. He received several weeks of treatment, and on March 20, 1940, he left Maryland and traveled to his mansion on Palm Island, Florida. Following the mass production of penicillin in the U.S. in 1942, Capone was one of the first American patients treated by the drug. While it could not reverse the damage to his brain, it slowed the advancement of the illness. In 1946, his doctor declared that Capone, now 47, had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old child. He spent his final years with his family and on January 21, 1947, suffered a stroke. While he began recovering from this, he contracted bronchopneumonia and suffered a cardiac arrest on January 22. 3 days later, he died after his heart failed as a result of apoplexy. A private funeral was held for Capone in Chicago. He was originally buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery, but in 1950, his remains, along with his father's and his brother's, were moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. While those in the judicial system believed that imprisoning Capone would help to dismantle his empire, all it really served to do was imprison Capone. The Chicago outfit continued to operate without him, under new leadership in the form of Frank Nitti, who had been Capone's underboss and who had also briefly served time in prison on tax evasion charges. The outfit was often left unbothered by law enforcement, as it had been before, but it now worked without the open violence that had been so notable during Capone's reign. Furthermore, once prohibition was repealed, organized crime in the city took on a lower profile. Many criminals looked at Capone as an example of what not to do. His notoriety and brazen nature were the very things that had brought him down. Despite never being convicted for murder, Capone is believed to have eliminated as many as 200 people during his lifetime. In the decades since, Capone has become a prominent figure in pop culture and has been the subject of countless books, films, and articles. The stereotypical image of a mobster wearing a pinstriped suit and tilted fedora are all based on Capone. and many of his features, including his accent, physical stature, and mannerisms, have been used and parodied for characters who are supposed to be involved with organized crime. Bizarrely, there has also been an emergence of Capone devotees. In Árborg, Iceland, a yearly festival is held named Al Capone Day, which features attendees dressed in the typical Capone 1920s garb, eating authentic Chicago deep dish pizza. In other cases, fans have been seen naming their pets after Capone and searching for bathroom tiles from a Chicago hotel that the mobster once stayed in. Reportedly, in 2016, stamps in the Republic of Tajikistan and the Kyrgyz Republic, both in Central Asia, featured Capone's face. In October 2021, a Sacramento auction house named Witherell sold roughly 200 Capone family treasures, including photos, jewelry, medals, prison letters, and even Capone's very own Colt semi-automatic pistol, as well as the bed he shared with May. It brought in $3.1 million. Many of the bidders were from countries such as Singapore and Turkey, which was a surprise to the auction house, which did not expect Capone's legacy to still be so far-reaching. After Capone passed away, the New York Times announced it was the end of an evil dream. The mobster had spent most of his life either being loved or hated by the public and the media. He was touted as a Robin Hood figure who was charitable, and the repeal of Prohibition in 1933 left some people feeling that bootleggers had been cleared of wrongdoing. However, many others saw Capone for what he was, a violent killer and a brutal gangster with no regard for human life, whose desire to be on top and accumulate wealth seemed to outweigh morals and basic compassion for others.